I wanted to have this slide up for a minute before we move to mine. Because just in terms of this region, if you look at sort of that, I think somebody mentioned in those introductions of the scale of reduction of consumption, and it was the scale of reduction of consumption that would be required and the magnitude of that challenge. And so just to bring, that equity lens in, if we talk about, say, food alone, actually 16% of children under the age of 18 in the Victoria region are food insecure. So almost 1 in 5. I mean, that's astronomical. That's children that aren't getting enough to eat. And I was just this afternoon, I missed our talk, Joe, really sadly, because we're doing an evaluation of a transition house community garden project as a food security project. And 70 to 80% of the moms in that project said they were skipping meals in order to feed their children. And the community association has started a smoothie, sort of start your morning with a smoothie, because they were finding that the moms were struggling with resilience because they were hungry. So you think about that. You've got moms that are single moms coming out of abuse backgrounds in transition housing, dealing with massive challenges around debt and child rearing by themselves, and probably legal issues related to separation, all of these issues, and they're dealing with it hungry because they had to go without food to feed their kids. So that was where I was this afternoon. But there's also some really great and empowering sides of of some of the project stuff that they're doing that we can talk about later. But I just, in the magnitude of this, of reducing our footprint, people are talking about, let's eat less meat. And I say for some families, they're not eating meat because they can't afford it. And it's such a privileged perspective to be coming in with, saying, hey, let's all eat less meat. And the person that's sitting at the table in poverty is like, what are you talking about? I can't get protein for my kid. So, I mean, they are finding that tofu is cheaper, and there are lots of ways to bring food to their children, and they're learning, but it's about food literacy and economic literacy and all sorts of issues. But anyway, so many of those issues are lost in some of these conversations that are more complex than people would think, that come in without having experienced that or worked with groups that are experiencing that. So I just wanted to put that on the radar as sort of a lens to start the conversation on, and a perspective. And I mean, we could have the same statistics around each of these areas. And the objective of this project, if we get funding, and even if we don't, probably we'll continue to work on it, but is to actually really explore the equity implications in each of these areas, the risks and the opportunities. And to do a deeper dive on those inequalities and some of the mitigations and adaptation measures we're looking at. So I just wanted to start there. Now can we put the PowerPoint up? Oh, also, while he's putting that up, I wanted to say, I always struggle with the balance of individual versus collective behavior in addressing climate change. I'm sure all of you do as well. And somebody, when I was working, the business that I started with some First Nations friends called the Fire Lake Group, worked with Indigenous communities impacted by oil, gas, and mining. It's based here in Victoria. It's now Indigenous owned. And we really pushed sort of best practices and we always talked about being the thread of the good example. And I just feel like after these introductions, everyone in this room should, don't undermine the impact that you're having every day by being the thread of the good example. So I just wanted to thank you all for that. So I wanted to start. Most of you are familiar with the One Planet model. Who here isn't? Okay, Michaela. Anybody else? So I'll just quickly give a little overview, and I know that both Cora and Trevor could speak a lot more to it if there's questions, but that it's got sort of 10 main principles that include a balance of environmental and social. So just to recognize that it does have things like health and happiness, equity in the local economy, culture and community, land and nature, sustainable water, local and sustainable food, travel and transport, materials, zero waste, and zero carbon. So the idea is, as we've been talking about, this footprint idea of the region, but to keep a lens of each of those priorities in the actions. And so any organization that joins as a One Planet member needs to be able to show that they're looking at each of those areas in their actions and meeting criteria for each of them. So it's a holistic model, which is why I'm here talking about social justice in a one planet region, is because I feel like it brings so many of the priorities together in a model. And there's so much potential for us to really do the deep dive on the social within this model. And we need to too. So I just wanted to make sure we're all sort of thinking about the same sort of thing. It feels like everyone in the room really gets social justice, so I don't really need to explain it, but just distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges. So later on in the talk, I'll be looking at the procedural side. So, we had the land acknowledgement for the Indigenous communities whose land we're on today, but I also want to make sure that we keep that lens right through the presentation and talk about that sort of process, fairness around who's making decisions, who has access, who doesn't, and then the distributive side of who's getting impacted and who's benefiting. So this is a Tesla. I don't have one as an NGO leader with 3 children. But the reason I have this picture up is because I'm sure you guys, somebody raised the concept of ecofascism, but I heard from somebody when I talked about this project once, we don't have time. Like, Diana, yes, it's probably, there's good reasons for addressing equity and it's the right thing to do, but we don't have time. We need to reach our climate targets. We don't have time. This is an imperative, and it might be messy, but we got to get there. And it makes this false assumption of a zero-sum game where the social. So he was like, we don't have time to slow the Tesla down. We need to put the pedal to the metal on the Tesla to hit our climate targets as fast as possible. So the Tesla metaphor. And I said, you're making an assumption that it would slow you down, and I know it will speed you up. So I know that everyone in this room gets that, but I also know that everyone in this room is probably going to face that. That's one of our challenges in addressing the equity, is bypassing that sort of zero-sum game and moving into a place where people do really see it as the only way we can move forward, that it'll accelerate, and I'll talk about accelerate again later, but accelerate both rather than slow either one down. So I think I've addressed all the topics on that one. The next slide here. So in terms of the reasons why, again, that we have to have a social equity perspective on our work is the rise of the right. So this is my first. There's a bunch of good reasons, and I know everybody in this room's on side, but is building that constituency. So we saw it in Alberta, we've seen it in Ontario, we've seen it in the United States, where you go backwards on climate policy if you can't bring that base to the table. And this is why the organizing and the collective action piece is so valuable, that grassroots piece. But it's also really important that the agendas of the climate policy and activities speak to economic security. And so this is why I'm terrified when I wake up in the middle of the night about the fact that the Bank of Canada says as many as 40% of jobs could be impacted by automation and artificial intelligence. And so I really worry that this, and somebody mentioned that in the introduction, this climate, sort of the dysfunction that'll happen in society around climate impacts and climate change will be so greatly exacerbated if we don't manage a social transformation, if we allow this massive disconnect to happen around automation and precarious work. So to me, again, it's about the constituency, but it's also about recognizing that vulnerability. So the climate action that we're moving towards now lands on a bed of vulnerability from precarious work, automation, and inequality that I think will undermine our ability to move forward with policy if we can't address those clearly for people and make people see their economic and environmental interests align. In a global scale, the other reason that it's the right thing to do to talk about equity, of course, as you guys know, is that disproportionately the impacts fall on low-income and vulnerable populations. And so this is just at the about a month ago or 2 months ago, Delhi had the highest temperatures in the world, and they were seeing 3 years of drought, and because of debt and lack of employment and lack of options, suicide skyrocketed for farmers. And so the impacts of climate change, as we know, are disproportionately borne. But it's not just in the global south. It's also inequalities within countries and within regions. And so it's the right thing to do. And this is the conversation that, the guy with the pedal to the metal on the Tesla says, yeah, it's the right thing to do, but we don't have time. And so we do need to show that it also will be positive on that, putting the wind in his Tesla, just so that we can bring those constituencies to the table on the social justice side as well. And let's talk about emissions inequality. So the third reason is the right thing to do is because we need to recognize, as we talk about that footprint of consumption and reducing consumption, that there's a big inequality in who's producing the emissions. And this is rich, generally around the world, rich populations versus poor populations. And this is an Oxfam study. It's really good data on who's producing emissions. So the richest 10% are responsible for, can't read that, half of lifestyle consumption emissions. And the poorest 50% are around 10% of lifestyle emissions. So this is that conversation. If we're talking in our region about reducing our footprint, we need to talk about who's got that footprint, like who's we. And this is, again, back to that conversation around who's eating meat. But, it applies to so many areas of consumption. And interestingly, there's been some interesting conversations lately and ongoing conversations around emissions in the global south, particularly places like China and India. And if you look at per capita emissions, they're quite a bit lower, but the folks are talking about sort of country level emissions. But I would suggest that a lot of those emissions are offshored from the wealthy people consuming products here. And so we also really need to look at emissions not just on production site, but also consumption site, so that we're not penalizing China for emissions for producing products that people are consuming here. So bringing that footprint conversation, bringing a bit more of an equity lens into who's producing, who's consuming, and who's making those emissions. Just so that we can make sure we're structuring our solutions to recognize that inequality. This is the per capita consumption patterns by country, and you can see Canada. We are surprisingly bad, and I was very surprised to see where we were on per capita lifestyle consumption emissions, and also the level of inequality in Canada around emissions. So you can see the top 10%, the bottom 50%, the bottom 40%. It's almost 3.5 times the bottom 40% to the top 50% here in Canada. And that gets much wider if you look at the bottom 10%. So just to say that picture of inequality in consumption and emissions, and this isn't really surprising, but it's good to have some data on the scale of it so that when we look at footprint reductions, we can really keep in mind this would play out again at the regional level, and particularly in this area because we do have very wealthy and very low income folks in Victoria. And so I would suggest that inequality of emissions production and consumption patterns would play out. And this is where our research will be really useful in terms of identifying how we target our mitigation and adaptation measures to keep that in mind. So then that was really my discussion of the why, and it feels like after the introduction we didn't really need to discuss why, but it's helpful in terms of making that argument with folks in the region and just thinking about how we approach the conversation with the broader community. So I want to talk a little bit about the other why, which is that there's unequal access and impacts from mitigation and adaptation. So we talked about unequal access around climate impact. So climate change impacts themselves have unequal impacts, but there's also inequality on the ground when making adaptation measures and mitigation measures. And I think that won't be a surprise to folks in here. But just talk a little bit about some of that. Programs around so the biggest drivers at the municipal level, of course, are transportation and buildings, the biggest drivers of climate emissions. And we looked at that circle. You had food, consumables, transportation. So if you were to look at the local level around the need for adaptation, the municipal level has the best levers for change because they are the place where you address both building stock, housing, and transportation. So that's why the One Planet region is a great place. I think that's the other reason that really draws me to this conversation is looking at a One Planet region is really looking at where the best levers are for addressing some of those big drivers, but it's not necessarily the best where the levers are for equity issues. So, for example, living wage, you raised the living wage issue, and the Planning Council produces the living wage for the region. And one of the ways the living wage actually went down last year was because of the programs around childcare that the government had put in. So the living wage for families went down, but for individuals went up. So looking at cost of living as a driver of inequality, there's lots of levers, but those aren't necessarily municipal. So looking at a One Planet region will require federal and provincial levers on a lot of the equity issues and municipal levers on some of the other issues. So, and some of those are very siloed. Like I was looking at housing instability and economic instability. And we've been working with the Tenants Action Group around that nexus of can't get a job because you can't get a house, can't get a house because you can't get a job. And this rise of precarious work and the implications for housing. A lot of those are provincial. All the labor market sort of conversations are provincial and the housing conversations are municipal, and they don't talk to each other. So one of the other things we really want to do as part of this project is identify those silos, which are one of the biggest challenges around bringing social justice and environmental change together, is to really try and cross those silos. And that'll be really important. So just talking about some of the mitigations and how those can land unequally. The most obvious one is housing. The Planning Council does the point-in-time housing homeless count. We're doing it in March again this year, so if anybody's interested in engaging, we're always looking for volunteers. The point-in-time count, we surveyed over 1,000 people and counted almost 1,000 homeless in the region, and that is unacceptable. And that isn't a full count, that's just the ones we reached. And that's sheltered and unsheltered. So housing is obviously an area where inequality is there's a housing crisis already. And so measures around housing that are looking at things like densification, we can really build that equity lens in. And it actually, more equity in housing is also better for the environment. So allowing people to live where they work and work where they live, allowing people to be in the core, that work in the core, all of those things will help address climate drivers while addressing equity issues around housing access. So they really work nicely in tandem and are a good example of how we can put the wind in sails of both. Transportation. Again, municipal transportation is one of the biggest drivers of carbon emissions, and the tech fix, that's why I had the Tesla in there, the tech fix around electric vehicles is not accessible to most people. And so what are the fixes that are going to be accessible? And that would be transportation, public transportation, things like making it more, like reducing the subsidies that are currently given to vehicle transportation, putting those into public transportation, in combination with allowing people to live where they work and work where they live, because otherwise it's if you address transportation without addressing housing, it can actually penalize people who can't afford to live in the core. So it has those programs have to work in tandem to bring an equity lens to the mitigations. So if you want to mitigate emissions through one, you have to mitigate them through the other as well. But I think that's the piece where it can, again, if it's done well, it can really accelerate both. See if I had any others here. And Trevor has, that's why I always say allowing people to live where they work and work where they live, because Trevor's also been pushing this idea of sort of localized work nodes out in regional areas. So you don't have to have people necessarily living where they work if they can bring their work to where they live and reduce commuting. So there's lots of really, with technology now, there's lots of really creative ways to do that. And at the same time, but address some of those commute challenges, and commuting is an inequity thing. I mean, if you look at the data on folks who are forced out of the core into the periphery and have to commute, their childcare costs go up. So it's not just transportation costs, $5,000 to $10,000 a year for a car, but childcare, because they're not there. That's that extra hour each way or whatever that they have to have their kids in before and after school care. And then you see those health outcomes go down and health costs go up because social cohesion, family cohesion, and commute and health. So all of those are equity issues that really need to be brought in with that health lens to how we're structuring our mitigation and adaptation measures. So and I think I mentioned a little bit earlier that concept of process versus distributed. It's not versus, it's both. We need both. We need justice in how our decisions are made. We need to bring folks that are disproportionately negatively impacted into decision-making processes. And we need to ensure that we're looking at the distributive impacts of and access to our adaptation and mitigation and climate impacts. So we need to do both. There you go. So some of the ways we can do that, in terms of procedural, in Portland, they have a climate justice committee and an equity committee at the regional level. Washington has one as well. There's a few other places. So I'm looking at working with folks in this region to build a climate equity committee that links to the city councils. And then try and bring forward voices. One of the big things that the council does is bring forward the voices of folks impacted by policy. So that's why we work with the Victoria Tenants Action Group around rental housing instability. In the point in time count, we make sure we're working with folks with lived experience. And so we do participatory research that really is about building that conversation between policymakers and folks that are impacted, and some of those disconnects of well-intended policies that just aren't landing well. And it's this is my first time really working at the municipal level. I've worked provincially and federally, and then the Firelight Group was national. And I've always worked with planning councils, which is why I fell in love with the planning councils too. I've always saw this job as that nexus where policy lands. It's always been so important. And so it is very exciting. I'll be sitting in meetings with downtown service providers, and they'll start talking about challenges, and I'll know exactly where that policy disconnect is. That's the asset limitation in the social assistance program. Because I've done so much policy analysis. So it's a great place to be. But I think we do need to bring those voices forward more. But it's not enough to have a sort of equity folks brought up into conversations. We also have to get corporate power out. And I think it's really more important. Yeah. It's more important to recognize that no amount of sort of token involvement of equity groups is going to make any difference in the status quo. So until we look really at who's benefiting and who's influencing our decision making, and reduce those vested interests from corporate and wealthy elites, then we will not be able to see progress on equity issues beyond token. But I also would suggest that we won't see progress on climate beyond token again. And they will constantly be pushing us to sort of individual behavior and changing a few more light bulbs and not structural change. And we need structural change on both sides. So that's on the process side. I would suggest process, yes, with it, bring those equity voices forward and focus, but also recognize that it's an issue of power, and that has to be tackled directly. On the distributive side, we've talked a little bit about some of those mitigation adaptation measures. Some of it requires system change. One of the examples I like is I was talking to somebody from the city of Nelson, and she was talking about how they own their public utility, so they can do in-bill financing for folks on retrofits. So she said they're just seeing guns a-blazing. People are picking up the retrofits program, and it's it's going ahead and everybody can access it because it's built into the public utilities financing. They don't have to deal with banks. They don't have to deal with a private utility and try and figure out how they're going to finance this stuff. They don't have to create credit programs that people access after they pay for these things. It's all just built right in. So that kind of structural change is probably what we need to look at to really have equity land well if we're going to look at that footprint change. The status quo in terms of how systems are structured and having people making a profit off of our utilities it's going to get in the way of both equity and climate change action, I would suggest. Yeah, I think I might stop there. I'll just circle back to sort of accelerate. There's some other ways that I think we can put the wind in the sails of climate action with social justice, and that's that we have this incredible social sector that it hasn't been tapped, I think, nearly as much as it could. And I have a great example. Somebody here talked about that zeroing waste. And there's some great initiatives in town to zero waste. And I was approached by someone who wants to do an incubator project turning waste into art supplies. And as a private for-profit business, the margins are super thin. The challenges, she has limited networks in terms of getting investors or building her market. But the social sector already has existing waste diversion sites. It has facilities. She could be paying rent to a social organization where it goes into a charity rather than some private landlord. And it could be structured to be based on profit returns so that she's a much more viable business. So facilities, and they have excess facilities in the social sector. And I've heard folks in the circular economy sector saying, we can't get facilities in town. I was like, I know facilities. So these conversations need to be happening where we're tapping those existing social infrastructure. They also have employees. They have folks that are in employment training programs funded by government. So this business could have employees who are folks with barriers that need employment training and supports, and she could get subsidized employees. And give people who need opportunities to work the opportunity to get that experience and get back on their feet. And of course, they offer art therapy and all sorts of other art programs, children's art programs, childcare. They have daycares. So they're the market for this product, the art supplies from waste. So from the entry to the exit of that business, the social enterprise has incredible synergies to offer that I think would make that business much more viable, meaning we could reach our goal of zero waste much faster if we can embed it in an existing social economy that can make those businesses sustainable while they make us more sustainable. So that's another way I think that we have lots of opportunities. So although I do worry, like Peggy, I'm optimistic because I see rising collective action. I see incredible capacity and interest, and I see lots of opportunity for synergies. And I feel like if all of you came to this room and have already got it, then we've got so much potential to take this conversation forward outside this room. So let's talk more about the options.